Now, we'd love your text on this. Do we believe the numbers used to describe the income and expenditure of Scotland? They're called the GERS figures, Government Expenditure and Revenue Scotland. They describe, in theory, the taxes raised in Scotland and the money spent in and for Scotland annually.
Well, before the independence referendum in 2014, they were cited by the pro-independence movement to say that Scotland was richer than the rest of the UK, but also cited by the Better Together movement to say that without oil, Scotland was doing worse than the rest of the UK.
Now, the numbers themselves seemed then to be trusted by both sides, but that's changed as many pro-independence campaigners now say the numbers aren't to be trusted. Recently, the debate's hotted up as Professor Richard Murphy, who's a chartered accountant and economist and whose policies were taken up by the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn's been blogging and broadcasting, emphasises his belief that the GERS figures are based on bad data and estimates. He said he would now vote for an independent Scotland.
And Kevin Hague is a businessman and blogger who has run his analysis of GERS figures from before the independence referendum. His case is that the GERS figures are to be trusted. He was very much for Better Together.
The text number is 80295. They both join me now. Richard Murphy's in our Cambridge studio, Kevin Hague's here in Glasgow. Hello to both of you. Thank you so much for spending time with us. Richard, first of all, why do you think, I mean, you do say in your blogs, you use the word that these are estimates a huge amount of the time. Why do you think the GERS figures are incorrect?
Well, we just heard what the Scottish Government said, and if you'd heard one word jumping out of the radio at you, it would have been estimate, because that's exactly what this data is. Let's put this in context. The GERS data is, as Graham Roy, who prepared it for many years, says, a view of Scotland as if it's a mini part of the UK. It takes UK data and apportions it to Scotland. Of the 26 figures for income in GERS, 25 are estimated. There is no Scottish data for income tax or for VAT, for national insurance, for corporation tax. Now, there are statistical bases for estimating, but let's be clear about it. Even since I started this current debate, the Office for National Statistics, who we also heard referred to, have said that those estimates are not good enough for the UK as a whole. And actually, we should be using real data for corporation tax, for VAT, and so on, to prepare our data. Now, if that's the case, Scotland needs this information too. The simple fact is that the GERS data was probably fine 10 years ago, when it was assumed that Scotland would never be independent, when it was assumed Scotland wouldn't manage its own economy, and when Scotland wasn't managing its own taxes. But everything has changed since then. So we have to change the data to reflect the current environment, not only in Scotland, by the way, but in Wales and Northern Ireland and in the north of England and Manchester, which is going to have devolved taxation powers, and maybe even in London, to reflect the reality of what's going on. And the reality is that politicians need data to make decisions on the powers that have been given to them, for example, on taxation, and there is none available. Let's not pretend GERS gives any useful information to a politician in Scotland, because it doesn't. It's literally made-up data from the rest of the UK. We have no idea if it's accurate. And however many times somebody chooses to process that inaccurate information, this is the GIGO principle. It will be garbage in, garbage out. GERS cannot tell us the answer to the question of whether Scotland is really running a surplus or a deficit, and whether Scotland can survive independently or not. This data is not fit for purpose.
Kevin Hague, why do you think the GERS figures are a lot more correct than he thinks?
Well, I mean, first of all, the key thing is they are fit for purpose. The most important thing is understanding what that purpose is. So Richard finished his piece there by saying they can't tell us what an independent Scotland's finances would look like. That is, of course, absolutely true. What the GERS figures do tell us is, historically, how do Scotland's revenue and expenditure figures look as an integral part of the UK. Now, Richard leans very heavily on this fact that they use estimates, that 25 of the 26 revenues are estimated. I mean, pretty much every number in every economy's national statistics are estimated. The question is, how accurate are those estimates? Now, those estimates are based on samples. They are based on statistically accurate samples. You can provide confidence intervals around those numbers. So as long as you understand the data, as long as you understand what the data can and cannot be used for, it is good data. It is trustworthy. It is compiled by people who are qualified statisticians, qualified economists, who consult widely on the methodology. It is all assembled by economists and statisticians in St Andrew's House in Edinburgh who decide the methodology, decide the assumptions, and do robust analysis. But Richard is right on one point, which is all it tells us is where we start from. It tells us as the Scottish economy currently performs as an integral part of the UK, and that is all it can do. That is all it is expected to do. I have to pick up on one point. Richard talks about income tax, and we don't know what income tax is generated in Scotland. There are 300,000 people in Scotland who now pay a higher rate of income tax. I can assure Richard that the Scottish Government knows who we are, and it is charging us those higher taxes. So to suggest that somehow we don't know that data is just a fly in the face of reality.
Look, I'm sorry, it's not a fly in the face of reality. We know full well that Revenue Scotland has had significant problems in identifying who is resident in Scotland, and that problem is not yet resolved. And it's going to get worse because remember that Revenue Scotland is having a massive relocation take place and is being denied the resources to undertake that task, a decision that I hope a Scottish government wouldn't do. But that's the whole point.
No, Richard, I am going to interrupt you there. There are 300,000 people paying those higher taxes who would find it very amusing that you think the Scottish Government doesn't know who they are.
Look, they do. Look, we know to some extent who they are.
Yes.
But we don't know for certain precisely whether they're the right people. And this is exactly what it matters. Let's come back to the core point. Let's not get distracted by that minor issue, because that's only one figure in a great big sum as a whole.
Absolutely.
Let's come back to the real issue. You said they're reliable. They are reliable information for London to decide on how it views Scotland. They are not reliable information on Scottish data. All that Scotland gets to prepare this, I'm not in any way demeaning the work of the Scottish statisticians who work on this. But if Scotland decides it won't collect data on corporation tax, it won't collect proper data on income tax, and I would challenge you that that does not exist as yet. I would suggest to you that there's no data on Scottish National Insurance or VAT, then the data that is used by those Scottish statisticians may be completely inaccurate. It's simply what London tells them. Does Scotland want to make a decision about its future based upon statistics which London lets it have? This is power-mongering from Westminster to deny Scottish politicians the information they need to make the decisions on what powers they want and how they use the powers they've already been given. And that's my point. Scotland is not now a part of the UK. As I said, this data may have been entirely appropriate 10 years ago, but Scotland now has a devolved parliament. Every single Scottish politician, whichever party they're in, this is not a party political point, should want this data, because otherwise, how could they make a decision in office and all of them want to hold office?
Briefly come back, Kevin Hague. Then I want to ask you both questions, Kevin Hague.
So briefly, I mean, Richard just asserts something which is factually incorrect when he says Scotland is not part of the UK. It is. I don't know if Richard's been paying attention, but we are still part of the UK.
No, Kevin, hold on, Richard. Let's be realistic.
No. Richard, you've spoken at length. You've spoken at length. Allow me to respond. You also say these are figures given by Westminster. Let's be absolutely clear. The Office for National Statistics, which is an independent agency, provides the data which the Scottish Government's statisticians and economists use. They are responsible. The Scottish Government statisticians in St Andrew's House decide the methodologies. They are responsible for all the assumptions. They do not always go with the assumptions.
But the variations are tiny.
They do not. No, that's right.
Or not.
After 10
or not.
Yes,
that's it.
Exactly.
Ridiculous.
After 10 years.
We're talking about tuppence in the petty cash.
No,
hold
on.
Okay,
exactly
all right, now
are,
stop it, both of you. We're getting into rammy.
The variances are tuppence. That's the point. We are accurate enough that
They're
now
not.
we are arguing about small numbers.
I ask you both questions? Right, the white paper, Scotland's Future, Your Guide to an Independent Scotland, written by the Scottish Government prior to the referendum. Chapter 2, Finance. The starting point for this analysis is the National Statistics publication, the Government Expenditure and Revenue Scotland, GERS. GERS is the authoritative publication on Scotland's public finances. Richard and Kevin, Richard first, were they telling the truth, lying, or just being stupid?
I think that they were saying what they thought was correct at the time. I would challenge that it was true at the time, and I would most certainly say it's not now, because I think
as GERS were right then, but they're not right now.
No, I've already said that 10 years ago it would have been. It was better than anything else at the time, but I'm not here to defend the SNP or anybody else. Let's be clear, that's not what I'm talking about.
You're here to rubbish the GERS numbers.
I am here to say that data is no longer useful for the basis of decision-making, which is absolutely obviously true to anybody with any accounting or economic sense.
I want to ask everyone a few questions. I've interrupted both of you. Kevin Hague, The white paper, Scotland's Future, Your Guide to an Independent Scotland, said the starting point for the analysis is the National Statistics publication, Government Expenditure and Revenue Scotland. GERS is the authoritative publication on Scotland's public finances. It goes on to say, the facts show that over the last 5 years, Scotland's public finances, despite being in deficit, are estimated to have been relatively stronger than the UK as a whole by a total of 12.6 billion. Were they lying, telling the truth, or being stupid?
They were telling the truth. The GERS figures tell the truth. And it's not just the Scottish Government, it's not just the SNP, it's not just the White Paper, which quotes GERS 15 separate times. It's the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, the Centre for Public Policy Research, the Fraser of Alexander Institute. I could give you a list of professors who've worked on this, who have consulted on this and used them.
So?
The data is good. It is it's like having a flat earth denier coming on and saying, well, here's somebody who says the earth is flat. And I'm sitting here going, do you know what? The wealth of authoritative voices and people like myself who, unlike Richard, have taken the time to understand the methodology behind the figures.
Shall we stop the abuse, Kevin, and let's talk about the realities?
Richard, let's talk about cost. You've talked about revenue. What GERS shows where there's a difference, and it shows a difference in cost in terms of expenditure per capita.
It doesn't show who makes the decisions, Kevin.
No,
it doesn't
it
show
doesn't,
that.
Kevin, right, you let Richard talk. Richard,
Right.
you talk.
Now let's come back. Let's
Spend.
stop the nonsense about
Talk
being.
about spend.
Let's not talk about being rude now. Let's just talk about the realities. For 15 years, I've been told by people in establishment positions that I shouldn't ask for information that apparently I'm not allowed. But I've changed the world with regard to country-by-country reporting to track down multinational companies who are cheating the tax system. It's now in the law in 100 countries. You don't need to laugh about it, Kevin. That's a fact.
Changed the world, Richard.
Yes, we have indeed. And we've got automatic information exchange from tax havens. We were told we couldn't have. Scotland can have this data, but the current establishment of which you are very clearly wedded and who you clearly like to use to endorse your opinion, which we know you think very highly of, Kevin.
The Scottish Government.
Yeah, look, they might think it's right at the moment.
I think you'd be surprised.
Kevin, my job as a professor is to ask awkward questions and point out where there are flaws. And this is deeply flawed data.
Right, so you believe it's flawed. I've interrupted both of you. Stop. This relatively stronger fiscal position is consistent with a long-term trend. This is the Fiscal Commission Working Group has estimated that since 1980-81, Scotland's run an annual net fiscal surplus of 0.2% of GDP compared to an average annual deficit for the UK of around 3%. The Fiscal Commission Working Group is Andrew Hughes-Hallett, who used to advise the World Bank, the IMF and the European Commission. Sir James Murley's Nobel Prize winner. Francis Ruan, director of the highly respected Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin, and Joseph Stiglitz, one of the world's most respected economists, winner of the Nobel Prize in 2001. So to both of you, Kevin Hague, were they telling the truth, lying or being stupid?
They were, of course, telling the truth. They understood the data. They knew the limitations of the data. And that's a key point here. They knew whether or not how to use it. They were
Professor
telling the
Richard
truth.
Murphy, were they lying, telling the truth, or just being ignorant?
They were looking at the data in a totally different way. All data is what, as an economist, I would call a social construct. You have to look at the data. Oh, stop laughing, Kevin, and show some understanding of the subject we're talking about.
You both laughed at each other, right? Let's just get on with it.
The issue is that you have to construct data to suit the purpose for which it is intended. They were looking at data and adapting that data for the purpose in question and came to a different answer from what GERS was offering. And it was entirely appropriate to do so. My point is that should be happening day in, day out, because the Scottish government is running an economy which is not part of the rest of the UK. It's the Scottish economy for the benefit of the Scottish people, and therefore this data doesn't need to be produced as a one-off, but consistently, so Scotland has the data it needs to make the decisions that are relevant for the people of Scotland.
It is produced consistently. There are 2 dedicated economists and 2 dedicated statisticians who work full-time producing the GERS figures. They consult widely on those figures. They are published every year. They have brought forward the speed with which they're published to help inform the debate. You said, and it's a critical phrase, the purpose for which it's intended. Nobody suggests that the GERS figures show what a future independent Scotland would look like.
But it isn't even relevant to a current government.
Though they're incredibly relevant to a current. Let's look at the expenditure side, Richard. Okay, over the majority of the expenditure is the Scottish Government's expenditure
60%,
budget.
but most of it imposed by Westminster. The constraints are laid down
but
by
the money that's
Westminster.
spent, Richard, and this is the purpose for which it's intended. It tells us what the money that is currently spent in Scotland buys us in public services in Scotland. It tells us what the money that the DWP spend on pensions and other welfare benefits, which gets you up to about 85% of the cost, by the way. It shows we know what that costs and we know what we receive from it. Now, of course, an independent Scotland could and indeed would have to make different decisions about that expenditure. And the question is, what would those different decisions be?
So GERS must show how much of that decision-making is actually simply Scotland spending Westminster's money and how much of that is Scotland deciding on how to spend money. And we discover very little is about Scotland deciding how to spend money. The variations are relatively small. So in other words, again, the people of Scotland need to know how much influence and control their government have now and how much they want it to have in the future.
Richard.
And the politicians, again, need to know that.
Richard.
Laid out for them, because they're not economists and they're not accountants, they're politicians, and they need data presented to them in a suitable format. As a professional accountant, as a professional economist, I know I have to meet my client's needs. If my client was the politicians of Scotland, they should have the data that is relevant to their needs, not data that is given to them on the back of information which London thinks suitable for its needs. You're entirely missing the point.
Just to wind
It's
up,
not
but hang on, but you have said, Richard, haven't you, that this nonsense was dismissed. Another example of Westminster's contemptible attitude to all things Scottish. The economic narrative should be Scottish, which is precisely what GERS is not. It's made in England. Kevin Hague, so you both completely disagree. So before we move on, we're going to run out of time, but what does it say if we keep producing a set of numbers that one half agree with now and other people don't agree with?
Well, okay, now, that's where I have to really stop you, John, when you say one half agrees with and the other half doesn't. You've got Richard Murphy, okay, and then you've got the wealth of qualified economists, including the Scottish government themselves, by the way. You know, it is, by the way, an outrage that there isn't someone from the Scottish government on here.
Well, they've given us the statement and we've read it out and we'll read it out again.
But the point is, it is not one half think that and one half think that. It is, there is an outlier who is trying to create confusion.
Come off it.
Oh, Richard, you cannot claim not to be an outlier. You're proud of being an outlier. You've changed the world, for goodness sake.
Well, yes, absolutely. You haven't, Kevin, but let's not worry about that.
Richard, you know nothing about it.
Stop it. I just can't stand it when it gets personal.
Well, neither can I, and I don't know why Kevin's made it so. Remember, he's blocked me on Twitter and other stuff.
Richard, are you an outlier or are you not?
I'm not an outlier. I'm an informed economist who's making a sensible point that this is data not suitable for purpose. All change is dependent upon somebody making a glaringly obvious point.
Who agrees with you if you're not an outlier?
I really don't care who agrees with me. My ego
then you're
doesn't.
An outlier.
Hang on, Kevin. My ego does not require a lot of people to say I'm right or wrong. Yours does. But let's not worry about that. I'm making a point reasoned from solid argument. I'm not saying X and Y support it. I'm simply saying my professional opinion is this data is not fit for purpose. I wouldn't want to manage Scotland on the basis of it. If I was an MSP, I would be really worried about this. So therefore, I would not want this data.
We have a minute left. Kevin, 30 seconds to you, then 30 seconds to
I think that Richard, genuinely, and I'm sorry, Richard, and I don't mean this to be abusive, something you don't seem to understand is the Scottish budget is controlled by the Scottish government. We go through a complicated process every year of agreeing what money is spent where, and we see the result of that expenditure.
But you believe in GERS?
So I believe in GERS, and that's reflected in GERS. But the idea that because those numbers are in GERS, they come from Westminster, they don't. It's the Scottish government's expenditure. They choose where it's spending. Free prescriptions, no tuition fees. We make those decisions here and we see the implications in GERS.
Professor Richard Murphy, we have 30 seconds left. He believes in GERS, you don't.
I don't. Only 60% of expenditure is controlled in Scotland, 40% is dumped on Scotland, and the revenue information is simply made up. We don't know it's true, and therefore we have to have the Scottish government, of whatever complexion it is, in the future asking for genuine information on what happens in Scotland. Then Scotland can decide.
We've run out of time. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Richard Murphy and Kevin Hague.
92 to 95 FM, 810 medium wave, and on digital radio, BBC Radio Scotland.
It's 1 o'clock now. Just before we move on to the news, let me just read out. We got a Scottish Government statement today. We've had a pretty combative argument between Kevin Hague and Professor Richard Murphy. Scottish Government say to us, GERS, this is Government Expenditure and Revenue Scotland, is a national statistics publication, which means that it's been independently assessed by the UK Statistics Authority to ensure it meets the code of practice for official statistics. National statistics are considered to be produced to a high standard and managed objectively and impartially in the public interest.
GERS estimates the level of public revenue raised in Scotland and the level of public spending for the residents of Scotland under the current constitutional arrangements. But it is not necessarily an indication of the finances of an independent Scotland, which could be dependent on a range of other factors, including the spending choices and priorities of the government of the day.